The old rancher lived alone. He had no family and no one to disturb his solitude. However, everything changed when 10 Apaches showed up at his ranch asking for help. It was just another day on the old rancher's ranch. First he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but then the sound grew louder. When he finally got a chance to look out the window, he nearly jumped out of his skin. The old man froze. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't outrun them, and fighting them would be futile. So he slowly opened the door and stepped out. It had been years since he last saw human faces, so he spent most of his time tending to his cattle. They were tall and muscular, and their eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. Our horses are exhausted, and we don't want to keep riding. He had heard stories about Apaches and wasn't exactly sure if he should trust them. We're not going to hurt you, he said. Their clothes were dirty and their horses were covered in sweat. He knew that if he turned them away, they might try to break into his house anyway, so he might as well let them stay. We just need a place to rest our heads for the night. We promise we'll be out of your hair by morning. The old man watched them closely as they unloaded their supplies and made camp. He couldn't help but wonder what their leader was up to. Was he planning something? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't exactly sure how to feel about the situation. He quickly retreated from the window and tried to calm himself down. Maybe he was reading too much into this. Maybe. The Apaches were just having a private meeting and they weren't talking about him. The old man waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes passed and he began to relax. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe the Apaches weren't a threat. We saw your lights and figured you could probably spare a few blankets and some food. Is that all right with you? This time, he grabbed a torch and walked toward the old man's house. The old man watched in horror as the man approached his front door. To his horror, he saw one of the Apaches breaking into his barn. The man was rummaging through his supplies, and the old man couldn't help but think that he was looking for something specific. He reloaded his rifle, just in case the other men came to help their comrade. When he finally came back to his senses, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. His barn was in ruins, and his animals were gone. It attacked him and his property, and he had defended himself. He also noticed that his weapons were missing. He knew who was responsible, and he felt terrible about it, but they didn't. Instead, the old man heard shouting and saw the Apaches running away. What scared the old man the most, though, was the weapons they were carrying. In the middle of the destruction, he saw a small pile of blankets. He walked over and picked one up. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew that he needed help. It was warm and smelled faintly of smoke, but it was clean. They weren't the typical gunslingers he had seen in town. These men looked like they meant business. They had taken his supplies and burned his barn to the ground, but they hadn't taken his revenge. He couldn't just stand by and watch as these men destroyed his property. He picked up a rifle that was hanging on the wall and crept closer to the window. He knew that they were desperate, but he couldn't help but feel angry about the damage they had done. He watched as they rode past his house, and out of curiosity, he followed them. The old man couldn't see what it was, but he could guess. The Apache had found his stash of weapons. The old man recognized the ranch. It was the same ranch where he had stayed after his own place had been destroyed. He couldn't see inside, but he could hear their voices. Even though he didn't have anyone to sell the meat to, he still raised the cows. He sold his ranch for a fraction of its value and bought a small house on the outskirts of town. He didn't want the Apache to hear him and turn around. If that happened, he would be in trouble. The old man fought bravely, but he was outnumbered. The Apaches were strong and determined, and they eventually overpowered him. The old man screamed for help, but no one came. He was all alone. The old man slumped to the ground and closed his eyes. He didn't want to see what was coming next. He had never dealt with Apaches before, and he wasn't sure how they operated. He was just glad to be alive. He locked all the doors and windows and gathered his weapons. The old man was scared, but he wasn't going to run. He didn't know what their intentions were, but he was prepared to defend himself. They'd come for revenge, but they were surprised to find that the old man was friendly. Had already faced death once, and he wasn't afraid of dying. The old man struggled, but it was no use. The Apaches were too strong for him. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready to defend himself. And besides, what good would it do? The Apache would probably just ignore him. He recognized the riders. It was the Apaches. As he looked out into the darkness, he saw a fire burning in the center of the Apache camp. They helped him rebuild his house and farm, and they learned about life outside the reservation. Around the fire were all of the men, including their leader. They had come to kill the old man, but they ended up befriending him. They were talking in hushed voices, and occasionally they would erupt in laughter. Perhaps it was a hobby, or maybe he simply liked living off the land, who knows? They had come for revenge, but they ended up finding friendship. "Thank you for letting us stay here," he said. "We won't forget what you've done for us." Dado, he had survived the attack, and now he had to rebuild his life. He started by gathering supplies and building a new shelter. He didn't have much, but he had enough to get by. He lived deep in the mountains, miles away from civilization. He looked in the direction of the old man's house and gave a signal to the others. All of them stopped talking and turned to face the house. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, but even he rarely came to visit. The old man was used to spending his days in silence. It didn't bother him that there was no one to talk to. After all, he had gotten used to it. However, everything changed one night. He was working late in his barn when he heard some commotion outside. "I don't have anything that belongs to you." Standing in front of his barn were 10 full-grown men. As he watched, they started pounding on the door of his barn, yelling for him to come out. "Don't hurt me," he said, raising his hands in submission. One of the men stepped forward. "We're not here to hurt you," he said. "We're here to ask for your help." The old man frowned. "Help? How can I help you?" "We need shelter for the night," the man replied. The old man hesitated, didn't want to turn them away, but he also wasn't sure if he could trust them. Seeing the uncertainty in the old man's eyes, one of the other men spoke up. The old man still wasn't convinced, but he had to admit that they did look exhausted. "All right," he said, "you can stay here for the night. But I'm not promising anything for the morning, you understand?" They all nodded their heads in agreement, and without wasting any more time, they untied their horses and led them to the stables. Once they had settled in, the leader of the group approached the old man. The old man just nodded his head. He didn't say anything. That night the old man couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, thinking about the Apaches camped out on his property. He got out of bed and went to his window. The old man continued to watch them, trying to make out what they were saying. Suddenly, he saw the leader stand up. The old man froze. What had he done to deserve this? But as if to prove him wrong, the leader of the group stood up again. Just when he thought the man was going to knock, he turned back and disappeared into the darkness. Suddenly, he heard a loud crash. He jumped and ran to his window. The old man considered calling out to the Apache, but he wasn't sure what he would say. At that moment, the old man realized that he needed to take action. The old man was careful not to make a sound as he moved. As he neared the window, he saw the Apache reach for something. The old man knew he had to do something. If the Apache got his hands on those guns, he would be in trouble. He took aim and fired. The shot echoed through the night, and the old man watched as the Apache fell to the ground. He stood there for a long time, watching them go. The next morning, the old man woke up to find his property destroyed. He'd never wanted to hurt the Apaches, but he had no choice. As he surveyed the damage, he saw something that made him smile. The old man knew what he had to do, gathered the blankets and headed into town. When he finally reached the nearest jail, he handed over the blankets to the sheriff and told him what had happened. The sheriff listened patiently and then nodded his head. "I understand," he said. "You did what you had to do." The old man thanked him and left the jail. As he walked away, he saw the sheriff talking to one of his deputies. The deputy shook his head in disbelief. "The Apaches," he said. "They're gone. They took everything they could carry and then they set fire to the rest." The old man felt a pang of sympathy for the Apache. He had no idea that the Apaches were planning on coming back. To be honest, the old man was a bit nervous about what might happen next. He decided to take the advice of the sheriff and move into town. He hoped that would be the end of it. But he soon learned that the Apaches were planning on coming back. The old man was working in his garden when he saw a group of riders approaching. He saw the riders stop at a ranch and dismount their horses. He hid behind a tree and watched as the Apaches entered the house. The old man couldn't believe his ears. The Apaches were talking about him. They were planning on taking revenge. The old man was scared, but he knew he couldn't run. He had to face his fears and fight back. He returned home and prepared for the worst. When the Apaches arrived at his house, he was ready for them. They tied him up and dragged him out of his house. They led him to his barn and threw him inside. The Apaches locked him in the barn and left him to die. He heard the Apaches right away, and then he waited for death to come, but it never did. The old man opened his eyes and saw that the door to the barn was open. He crawled out and looked around. He was alone. The old man knew what he had to do. He spent the next few weeks rebuilding his life. He didn't know what had happened to the Apaches, but he didn't care. One day, the old man was working in his field when he saw a group of riders approaching. They had come back to finish the job. He greeted the Apaches and invited them to his home. The Apaches entered the old man's house cautiously. The leader of the Apaches stepped forward and spoke. "We're sorry for what we did to you," he said. "We only wanted revenge." The old man smiled. "I understand," he said, "but you don't need revenge. I've already suffered enough." The Apaches were shocked. They had expected the old man to be angry, but he was calm and collected. "Why don't you stay for dinner?" the old man said. "We can talk about what happened." The Apaches agreed and sat down to dinner. They ate and drank, and the old man told them stories about his life. The Apaches were fascinated by the old man's stories, and they soon forgot about their plans for revenge. The Apaches stayed with the old man for several days. When it was time for them to leave, the Apaches were sad. The old man saw them off as they rode away. He knew that he would never forget them.